Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Solomon's dealings with God and the nations, 1 Kings chapters 9 and 10. So far in the story of Solomon, we saw Solomon gaining the kingdom back in chapters 1 and 2. He marries the princess of Egypt at the beginning of chapter 3, and then we see his request for wisdom from God, and God grants him the request. That is illustrated in the next section, where two prostitutes come to Solomon seeking a judgment between them. They're arguing about one of them has lost a son, and they're arguing about the surviving son to whom it belongs. And he uses his wisdom to bring about a good resolve. People are able to see that. Next, we see his government, and there's a reference to forced labor and horses that are gathered as we're beginning to see Solomon's prosperity. Hiram, the king of Tyre, comes down and provides supplies in chapter 5. And then we see him building his temple as well as his palace. Most of these chapters, chapters 6 and 7, deal mostly with the temple, but there's also a reference to his house. His house is being built. And finally, the pivotal point is when the temple is dedicated to the Lord. That's in chapter 8. And that's the pivotal point in the whole story. After that, we see again a reference to the temple, and God is promising what he's going to do in it and through it. Then again, we're going to see Hiram and his compensation as it works out, and you begin to again see Solomon's wisdom. Solomon actually got the better part of that deal. Again, there's a reference to government and the forced labor and the horses, and latter part of chapter 9. And then instead of two prostitutes, now we're going to see the Queen of Sheba coming to Solomon. So notice the prostitutes that come to Solomon in chapter 3, verse 16. Now the Queen of Sheba comes to Solomon. We see again Solomon's wisdom and wealth referenced at the latter part of chapter 10. And then another reference to his marriages. We'd had him marrying the princess of Egypt early on, but now he marries a number of foreign wives. And the negative part is that takes him away from the Lord, because he goes and worships these pagan gods. And so we're going to come to chapter 12. And at the beginning, Solomon had gained the kingdom. Solomon has already died now, and his son Rehoboam in chapter 12 is going to lose the kingdom. We'll be seeing that next time, a preview of things to come. So in the section we're at now, beginning in chapter 9, we're going to see Solomon's wise dealings, as he deals first with the Lord, then with Hiram, king of Tyre, with the Pharaoh, with the pagan inhabitants of the surrounding nations, and finally with the Queen of Sheba. Notice the first of those is with God, and then all of those others are his dealings with people. Now already there are problems maybe on the horizon. They're not there front and center, but there are hints. For example, the Lord warned Solomon of the consequences of breaking the terms of the covenant. It's maybe a warning of what's going to come in chapter 11 when he's going to break the terms of the covenant. He's going to start worshiping other gods. Hiram comes, the king of Tyre, is going to express dissatisfaction in his dealings with Solomon and with the gift of certain border cities that are bordering between Tyre and Israel. And Hiram won't be happy. Of course, somebody said the essence of negotiation is when both parties go away from the table not entirely satisfied with what they've gotten. And maybe that's part of the case here too. Next, we're going to see the Israelites who do not complete the purging of the Canaanites from the land. And again, that's going to be mentioned. Of course, that's been an ongoing issue. It's going all the way back to the days of Joshua, but that's still the case here. Chapter 9, verse 1, then, it came about when Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to do, that the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. And God comes and he promises, first, here's the promise: if you walk before me as your father David walked, in the integrity of heart and uprightness, doing according to all that I've commanded, keeping my statutes and my ordinances, if you do that, that's the if clause. And then God says, I will establish the throne of your kingdom over Israel forever. Notice it was conditional on what Solomon does. If you do that, then I will establish. However, if your sons, and here's the negative side of that, if you or your sons shall turn away from following me and shall not keep my commandments and statutes and go on and serve other gods and worship them, if you do that, then I will cut off Israel. Israel will be a proverb and a byword. This house will be ruined, and everyone will be astonished. So it's a conditional series of promises that are given, and these are covenantal promises. Verse 10, it came about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the two houses, the house of the Lord and the king's house, that Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress, timber and gold according to all his desire. Then Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. So Hiram's going to receive some cities from Solomon as payment for the supplies that he has sent down his way. Verse 12, so Hiram came out of Tyre to see the cities which Solomon had given him. And we read, they did not please him. He said, what are these cities which you have given me, my brother? So they are called the land of Kabul to this day. Now that word Kabul, the Phoenician word, Kabul means worthless. And maybe there's a little play on words because that's the word that we read here. And yet, if we had said that word in Hebrew, it'd be spelled differently. But Kabul means pledged. And so Solomon, there's a sense there where Solomon's giving what was promised, but the king of Tyre is not all that happy with his payment plan. Well, next we move to Solomon's building programs. And we're looking at a series of overhead charts to show you what gates look like. Notice a gate was not just a simple, hole in the wall. It would be a large structured assembly. I'm looking at the chart. Now we're going to see a model of what that looks like. Here's a model of the gate assembly at Megiddo. So you're seeing in the lower right, you're seeing sort of a map of what that looks like, and then you're seeing the model of the same thing of this gate assembly. And it's designed so that if an invader breaks through the outer part of the gate, then he's still in an enclosure and he's surrounded on all sides by defenders. And he has to make it through this torturous, twisty path to get into the city. And Solomon builds up a number of these gate assemblies. Today you can go there and you can still see, it's not standing as it was in that day, but you can still see the foundation stones still there. This is the one at Megiddo that we're looking at. Now, there's another parallel that we point out. Back in chapter 3, we'd had Pharaoh's daughter mentioned in chapter 3, verse 1, and then the whole issue of sacrificing at high places. And then we had the first appearance of the Lord to Solomon, again back in chapter 3. And then we've seen his wisdom at work, and as well as his building projects, which included, remember, the temple. But then we see the second appearance. This is sort of serving as bookends. You had the first appearance of the Lord, and now God appears again. And again, we see Pharaoh's daughter referenced in chapter 9, verse 24. And again, we see sacrificing, but this time it's sacrificing in the temple. Now, it was one of my old professors at RTS, Richard Pratt, that points this out, and I think it's worth sharing. It's good. So chapter 9, verse 26, King Solomon also built a fleet of ships at Ezon-Geber, which is near Elot, on the shore of the Red Sea in the land of Edom. Now, this was outside the territory of Israel. Now, if you go to modern Israel today, Elot, or actually they'll call it Elat, but it's the same name and it's the same place. That's actually become part of Israel nowadays. But it was not in Solomon's day. It was in the land of Edom, and yet he had his harbor there and his fleet of ships there in the, by the way, notice we're entitling that the Red Sea here in our translation. Remember, the Hebrews called this the Red Sea, Yam Suf, but it's the same place. It's the place we call the Red Sea. And this place was called, it was noticed at Ezon-Geber. Literally, that means the strong backbone. And we also call that body of water there, it's part of the Red Sea, but we also call it the Gulf of Aqaba. And Aqaba means the back. So really the name has come through to us through translation even 3,000 years later. Verse 27, and Hiram, remember, was king of Tyre, ocean-going people, and Solomon, even though he built a fleet of ships, the Jewish people are not largely known for their seafaring capabilities. Well, Hiram sent his servants with a fleet, sailors who knew the sea. The Egyptians, or excuse me, actually the Egyptians didn't either, but the Hebrews were not that knowledgeable about the sea, but Phoenician sailors would know the sea. along with servants of Solomon, and they went to Ophir. Now, we're not sure exactly where Ophir is. One guess, educated guess, is that perhaps this is talking about coastlands around India. And maybe that's true. Notice they went to Ophir and took 420 talents of gold from there and brought it to King Solomon. So these trade routes are now open in the time of Solomon. Another traveler that we see, this is in chapter 10, verse 1, when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon. Now, again, we believe Sheba is that area to the south of Arabia, the very southern part, where the Red Sea connects with the Indian Ocean. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with difficult questions. And so we have this contrast between Sheba, but I find it interesting to contrast her coming to Solomon with the travels of another group when we get to the New Testament. That will be the Magi. Remember the Queen of Sheba, she rolls over this land called Sheba. We believe it's in southern Arabia. Wherever it is, it's to the south of Israel. The Magi, meanwhile, are going to be those who held positions of authority in Parthia, what we call, well, we called it Persia until 1935 or so. Now we call it Iran. But they held positions in authority to the east of Israel. In the case of the Queen of Sheba, she came bearing gifts of gold and spices and precious stones. And of course, you remember the New Testament story. The Magi came bearing gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Queen of Sheba, she came to see the wisdom of Solomon. And I like to think that the Magi came to see the one who is greater than Solomon. Of course, he was just a baby at the time, but they came to see the one who had been born King of the Jews, the better Solomon. Chapter 10, verse 6, she comes, she listens, and then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. And behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard." And so she comes and she looks, and she wasn't sure she'd be impressed. And she says, "I'm way more impressed because what I see is that the reports did not do you justice." Verse 8, "How blessed are your men, how blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness." And so this picture of one coming from afar to see wisdom. We're told in the New Testament, Jesus says, the Queen of the South, and he's speaking of Sheba, the Queen of the South will rise up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and behold, something greater than Solomon is here. You see, Jesus is the one who was greater than Solomon. And so, listen to him. Next, we see the wealth of Solomon. That's going to be in chapter 10, verses 14 through 29. And we read in chapter 10, verse 14, "Now the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold." You know, that's the only other place. Remember how in the book of Revelation you see that number 666. This is the only other place where we see that number. I don't know if it has any bearing, if it's just by chance that this certain number, which was going to represent the idea of the beast when we get to the book of Revelation. And that was how much gold Solomon had. Makes you wonder if the beast is sort of financially motivated. Well, verse 15, "Besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. And King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. And he made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon." And these shields overlaid with gold are going to be a sign of his great wealth. Verse 18, "Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold." Now, notice these things aren't solid gold because gold's valuable, but everything's overlaid with gold. So when you look at it, you're going to see the gold. Verse 19, "There were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top at the throne at its rear, and arms on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms." These, artificial statues of lions, as sort of the honor guard on either side of Solomon. Reminds us of the honor guard of cherubim that are stationed on either side of the Ark of the Covenant, the throne of God. And verse 20, and 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps, on the one side and on the other. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. And so Solomon was sort of setting the parameters of what a king ought to look like. Verse 21, all King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. None was of silver. Remember how the Pharaoh had a silver cup and Joseph had a silver cup, and that was considered valuable. Here it wasn't considered valuable in the days of Solomon. Silver had de-escalated in value because there was so much gold. Verse 22, for the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Now Tarshish, we believe, is located, it's out on the Mediterranean, perhaps Spain. And of course that would eventually become a Phoenician colony. And notice with the ships of Hiram, he is the Phoenician king. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish came, bringing gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. In other words, these outlandish items and even outlandish animals coming from far distances away. Verse 23, so King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom, and all the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart, and they brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. This idea of coming to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And we look for a day when instead of Solomon, they will come to hear the wisdom of Jesus. Verse 26, now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 17 had actually contained a prohibition against multiplying horses, and against a king multiplying wives for himself, and against a king multiplying silver and gold for himself. And you have to wonder, is Solomon breaking that? And I don't want to say for sure, but we're going to see in the next chapter that his heart will be moved away from the Lord. Verse 27, and the king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and he made cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees that are in the lowland. And I can't help but think the description of the New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, when they're using gold to pave the streets. Gold? Yeah, we use that as pavement. Verse 28, also Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Kuwait, and the king's merchants procured them from Kuwait for a price, and a chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And by the same means they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of the Arameans. After all, horses and chariots had now become the sort of cutting-edge technology for the military of the world, and Solomon was importing and exporting. He was the arms dealer for the entire world. Again, this reminds us of what the Messiah was called to be. There's a passage over in Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1, where Isaiah says, the word which Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it will come about, not in Solomon's day, but in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains, and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Remember how nations were coming to see Solomon? There's coming a day when they'll come to see the one who is greater than Solomon. We continue to read, and many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and it has. The new covenant, written not on tablets of stone, but in men's hearts, has gone out from Jerusalem, beginning in Acts 2, and it still continues to go out. And the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples. and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war. And if we can only learn the message of Jesus, then maybe this can take place.